All right, session is now being recorded. So, quick overview of what we're going to be going over this session. We're going to be going over getting inputs. We already went over getting the mouse input. We will look at getting key inputs in this session. We'll be looking with range loops for blank in range. We'll be looking at while loops, which is a different kind of loop. And we'll be going over lots and lots of examples to get lots of practice on all of these concepts. Very good. Let's get started with some more input. So like I said, we're going to be reviewing the mouse press function. So y'all can remember how we used mouse press to detect mouse input. We'd use it something like this. Like maybe you would use it in an if statement to say if mouse pressed, then draw an ellipse at mouse X and mouse Y. And that'll give you a program like this, where if you're clicking, you can make circles. Great. So not only can we do mouse inputs, we can also do keyboard inputs. So we can also check if the keyboard button is being pressed down by using key pressed, which will return a Boolean value much in a similar way to mouse. So if no keyboard button is pressed, key pressed will return false. And if a keyboard button is pressed, key pressed will return true. Now you may be wondering, how can we check which key was pressed? So the computer will remember last key event, which key was pressed, and it will store this in a variable called key. For example, if you press A on your keyboard, the key variable will be set to A. If you release Z on your keyboard, the key will be set to Z. And yeah, so that's how the key variables work. So you can specify in your if statements which key should be pressed. So for example, if key pressed and key equals G, remember this is the comparison operator. We will fill the background with G or fill the background with green, and then we'll have a program like this where the key G is held whenever we're pressing down the G. And here's another example. We can create text of whichever key is pressed whenever we're pressing a key by putting it in an if statement and then printing the text of whichever key was pressed whenever a different key is pressed. So that'll create something like this, where each different key will show up on the screen when you're pressing it. All right, now here's some more about loops. You'll recall from last session, we learned about for loops, which will repeat code a certain number of times. And it's great for working with lists and completing repetitive tasks. So like, for example, using a for loop, we can go through each item in the list. For example, if we had a shopping list that had 4 items and we said for item in shopping list, the code here will print each item in the list. So another example is, what if we had a list of shades and a list of Y positions? How could we go through the values in each list in the same loop? So range is a list of numbers from 1 to 0 less than the number you give it. So for example, if you wanted to make range 9, that would be the range from 0 to 8. It will not include 9, so it will start at 0 and it will stop at 8. So you will include 9 variables in this range altogether, including 0. The range is convenient if we want to repeat a code a specified number of times. So for example, if we wanted to print high 3 times, we could write something like for I in range 3, print high. And so that will go through this for loop a total of 3 times. So range 3 will equal 0, 1, and 2, because loops will, because lists will always start at 0, and it will print high a total of 3 times. Okay. We can also use range with loops and multiple lists. So if we wanted to use I as an index to access values from lists, we could use for I in range 3 and then print numbers in the list I. So that would iterate over all the numbers in this list because there are only 3 numbers and we're going over range 3. We'll print the number in index 0 first. And in the next loop, it will go through and print the number in index 1. And in the next loop, it will go through and print the number in index 2. Going over what number is being printed each time. Okay, and we can also use range with multiple lists, because then we don't have to specify which list we're iterating over. We can just iterate over a range, and then we can have one for loop that will print items from multiple lists using the same. Okay, now it is time for our first quick question. Question is, what will the following code print? So just take a look at that quickly. And we'll pull this question up. Okay, it looks like everyone got those answers in. So for all of you who answered 9, that is the correct answer. Good job to all half of you who answered correctly. And so we'll just quickly go over the solution. So as a reminder, if we do for I in range 3, that will just go over the indexes 0, 1, and 2. And so if you look at inside of this for loop, we are adding the items from list 1 to result, and then we're also adding the items from list 2 to result. So if we go through this loop, the first time it's going to go over the first item in each list. So it's going to go over 0 and 1, and then 3 and 1, and then 2 and 2. So we're just adding all these numbers together, and the result of that should be 9, which we'll then. Good, okay. Carrying on with the slides. So we can also use the length of the list and a range to make sure that we go through each value. So this is useful for having for loops that go over lists that change in size over time. So by using len, which will give us the length of the list, we can store that value in a variable, and then write for I in range n, which will go over the length of this list, which can be defined dynamically. It can be a different size list each time. And then that will just print every value in our list, or more, it'll define the size of the ellipse using every value in this list, no matter how big that list. Okay, so back to our example we were talking about before with this bar graph. We can not only store the y coordinates in a list, we can also store different shades. So we wanted to create all these bars in a single for loop. We could first fill colors with I from shades, and then we can find our rect with the y position from list 1. So that'll allow us to create a bunch of different bars that are all different shades and in all different positions. Okay, and now onto our first exercise. So this is combining what we talked about with key inputs and what we talked about with lists. So we're going to make 3 circles that move to the right when you're clicking D, and move to the left when you're clicking E. So we're going to be using for loops and lists for this. And bonus is to use the WASD keys to make circles move left or right. So we will have 10 minutes on this exercise. And we got the breakout rooms ready?
Yep, they're good to go. And they're open now.
All right, great. Okay. So I hope you all had a okay time with that exercise. Go over solution for that quickly, and then we'll carry on. So here's a quick example of what this should look like. If you didn't get the eyes or the movement, that's okay. The main point for this exercise was just making sure we are able to store the x coordinates and the y coordinates in 2 separate lists, and then have a for loop that goes over the range of the length of one or both of the lists. In this case, we used X list. We could use Y list. It would accomplish the same thing because they're both the same length. And then we use that to create all our different ellipses in each of the different. So I hope that all makes sense. Now we're going to be continuing with the slides, starting with a new type of loop. So we've learned about for loops, which lets us iterate over a list. There's another very useful type of loop that we will use in Python, and that's the while loop. So similar to an if statement or an elif statement, a while loop will check if a statement is true, and if that statement is true, it returns a true Boolean value. It will repeat through the loop as long as that statement is true. So here's an analogy for a while loop. Let's say we have a loop where start eating food off your plate. Well, there is still food on your plate. Take another spoonful. And so we will loop through, well, there's still food on your plate. And if there is ever not food on your plate, this statement returns false. We will stop looping through this and let's say put your dishes. So this is good because you maybe don't know how many spoonfuls it will take to eat all your food. So we can't hard code that into a loop. So we just want to loop while a certain condition or certain statement is still true. So how do we use a while? So let's go over an example of a loop that counts to 10. So we'll define a variable I as equal to 0. And we will say, well, I is not equal to 10, print I, and add I plus 1. So this loop will continue to run and continue to print whatever value I is equal to, as long as it is not 10. So we'll go through and first print 0, then print 1, and then all the way up to 9, and then it will add 1 more, and then it will check again if I equal to 10, and since this time it will be equal to 10, it will exit the loop. Okay. So that's while. Another example of something you should not do when you are using while loops is forget to iterate the value. So let's imagine that we didn't have the line that kept adding 1 to I. So what would happen now? So the first time through this loop, condition is still while I is not 10, we print I. So we go through once, print 0, we go through again, print 0, go through again, print 0, go through again, print 0, and then it keeps going. It's stuck in an infinite loop. So you got to make sure to always increment your variables or decrement your variables so that we will reach this condition. Because if you don't, you'll get stuck in an infinite. So now for our second quick question, let's try another example of a while loop. Which line of code must we add to avoid creating an infinite? So which of these will prevent us from getting stuck in an infinite? Question? Okay. So for all of you that answered A is the correct answer for this question. Congratulations for everyone who answered correctly. Let's quickly go over the solution. So if you look at the condition for this while loop, it says we will loop while I is not equal to 10. And so if I starts at 0, only one of these conditions that will eventually make I equal to 10 is I equals I plus 1. Because then we are incrementing I. In both B and C, we are decrementing Y, either by subtracting a positive number or adding a negative. Both of these will make it so I is lower and then it just keeps getting further away from 10 and never closer to 10. So that will still create an infinite. Because we'll never have the case where I is equal to 10. Okay, now we'll continue on. So there are some places where for loops are useful and some places where while loops are useful. They're both useful for repeating code, but for loops mostly be used to repeat as many times as you tell it. So this is either good for iterating over a loop or or not iterating over a loop, over a list. And then while loops are good for repeating until a condition is false. So in for loops, you do need to know how many times the loop repeats, and in while loops, you don't necessarily need to know how many times it needs to repeat. So that is one of the pros of using while loops, not needing to know how much. So here's another example of using a while loop. So let's say x equals 50, and we want to loop while x is less than mouse. So this will draw an ellipse until mouse x equals a point that is greater than 50. So keep creating circles and then eventually stop. Okay, so now here is an exercise using while. So use a while loop to build this pyramid, kind of similar to the bar graph exercise. We're creating bar graphs, just going down the screen. So a hint is also to start with the variable y equals 10 and use it to make your while loop. So leave that open-ended, and we will give you, let's say, another 10 minutes to work on this exercise. Okay, it looks like everyone's back. So quickly go over the solution for this exercise. So a couple things to keep in mind. X is the same for all the bars and the height is the same for all the bars. And the length is always going to be determined by the mouse y. We want to figure out how we can connect the length of the bar and the y position of the bar in the loop's body. And so how we do that, or one possible way we can do that, is by having one y variable and having it so that we are increasing the height, or not the height, the width by 50 each time, and we are also increasing the y position. So we're using two variables to increase both of these, and we're also using a while loop to only create more bars while y is less than the mouse y. So this will only create the bars that are in the area where your mouse is. Okay, so hopefully you got something like this. And we'll just carry on with the last couple slides. Okay, next thing we're going to be learning about is random numbers. So when working on games, random number can be super useful. In order to use any function in the random module, we must first import it. So this is another module that we need to import, like processing, which we've been using so far. We'll also need to import random. So random.random will give a random decimal between 0 and 1. That's not very useful, but don't worry, there are other functions in this module. So we can use randint that takes the two arguments a and b. It will give a random integer number between a and b. So for example, if we were to put a and b as 0 and 10, it will give us a random number between 0 and 10 inclusively. So this can return 0 and it can also return 10 as values. Okay, so here's an example of random. We can use randint to randomly generate a random integer between 25 and 75, and use that random integer to create differently sized circles. So we will define an ellipse and define both horizontal and vertical diameter as this random number D, and then every time we click on the screen, it will create different randomly sized circles within these. Okay, so that is it for our lecture for now. So then I will give you the rest of the session to work on your exercise. So here are the Bug Busters exercises. One of them, whenever you use the mouse button on the screen, it will add circles, which will move up the screen. And then this one is the same thing, but the circle will expand over time wherever you create it. And Pythonic lava exercises. Here those are. So we'll have until end of the session. I think I'll call you back around, let's say 30 minutes from now, because we have a couple of things to present before end of the session, but you'll have the whole time until then to work on these exercises. I'll let you do that. one thing I wanted to go over before we wrap up this session is something that's going to be happening in the next couple of weeks. So there's this Canis hackathon that is happening. If you're not aware, Canis is the Canadian Network for Information and Security. They're going to be hosting a data visualization hackathon on April 1st and 2nd. Maybe on April Fool's Day, but it is definitely not a prank and is a real hackathon with real prizes that you can sign up for and participate in. All skill levels welcome, and you can do it solo or with a team. I recommend doing it with a team. These things are way funner with teams. So here's the link to sign up for that. And then I think we'll just pull up our end of session surveys, and that'll be it. Okay, looks like we had a couple more people find this content more than usual. That's okay. Bit of a learning curve towards the end. And then, Janine, do we have the question about pacing or no? Yes, how was the pacing of the session? Okay. I mean, okay, looks like it was a bit more difficult. Maybe pacing was a little fast. That's good to know. Good to get that feedback. Okay, and with that, we are at the end of the session. So make sure you submit your exercises by this time next week. So remember to do that, and remember to sign up for the Canis Hackathon if that is something you are interested in doing. And I will see you all next week. Okay, are we joining a breakout room for this?
I made one, but it looks like all the mentees have left now.
Oh, okay.